statutes, and other resources and make the information available through NCSL's website and through testimony to legislative committees. In addition, tax incentive issues are within the jurisdiction of two NCSL standing committees, the Committee on Budgets and Revenue and Labor and Economic Development Committee. NCSL standing committees allow legislators and legislative staff to share state experiences in shaping public policy and managing the legislative institution. They meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit and the NCSL Fall Forum. For more information on these meetings or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at ncsl.org. Next slide, please. The purpose of this jointly sponsored webinar is to examine state efforts to evaluate tax incentives and to explore effective approaches to developing meaningful goals and metrics. It features 3 presentations. The first presentation will highlight research conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust on evaluating tax incentives. This discussion will be followed by presentations from evaluators in 2 states, Minnesota and North Carolina, who will share their experiences and state perspectives. After we hear from our panelists, we will open up the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. Your question will not be visible to everyone, only to the webinar administrators. We will take as many questions as possible within the time we have available. Next slide, please. Our first speaker, Julie Sray, is an associate with Pew's Economic Development Tax Incentives Project, which helps states advance policies that make their incentives effective, accountable, and fiscally sound. In this position, she works with state officials, including technical assistance, to develop and adopt policy solutions. She also conducts research for 50 state studies that highlight proven approaches to tax incentive evaluation that provide guidance for other states. Next slide. Also joining Julie is Bob Zrabnik from the Pew Charitable Trust. Bob will not be making a formal presentation, but he will be available as a resource during today's webinar. Bob is the Policy Director for Pew's work on state fiscal health and economic growth. He supervises initiatives that help states improve the return on investment from economic development tax incentives and better manage revenue projections and volatility. He oversees research on tax incentive evaluation and long-term budgeting practices and directs technical assistance provided to state leaders, including data analysis, policy development, and outreach to key stakeholders in the public. Next slide, please. Our second presenter will be David Kirshner. David is a senior program evaluator with the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor. In addition to financial audits, the legislative auditor provides the Minnesota legislature with independent, in-depth evaluations of programs managed or overseen by state government agencies. The topics are chosen by a bipartisan legislative committee. David joined the office in 2006 and has worked on evaluations related to economic development as well as evaluations in several other policy areas. Next slide, please. Our final speaker will be Brent Lane, Director of the Carolina Center for Competitive Economies, which is part of the Frank Hawkins Kennan Institute of Private Enterprise. The Institute works with communities to make strategic decisions and investments to become economically competitive and prosperous. He brings to this work 3 decades of experience at the state and regional government levels and within the nonprofit sector integrating programs and personnel to support targeted economic development initiatives. So now that I've introduced all the presenters, I will turn the program over to Julie Sray. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Julie Sray, and I'm a researcher with the Pew Charitable Trust State Economic Development Tax Incentives Project. And first, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we mean when we talk about tax incentives. So these are exceptions to regular tax rules that are meant to achieve some kind of economic goal by encouraging people or businesses to do something that they otherwise wouldn't have done. And that something is usually to locate a company in a certain area or create or retain jobs or to invest in equipment and facilities. And when states want to spur businesses to create jobs and make new investments, tax incentives are usually the primary tool that they use. And the stakes are high. Policymakers are spending billions of dollars each year on tax incentives. Obviously, they don't want to miss opportunities to spark economic growth, to create more jobs, and increase earnings. Next slide. At the same time, policymakers have to consider the trade-off. A dollar spent on a tax incentive is one that they can't spend on other investments, such as education or infrastructure. And if the incentive is not effective, then the state might actually bring in less revenue over the long run. These high stakes are driving our interest in tax incentives here at PEW. Across many issues, we've found that government delivers better results when policymakers base their decisions on solid evidence, invest in programs with strong returns on taxpayer dollars, and choose solutions that work over the long term. Next slide. With these interests in mind, PEW released 2 reports last year focused squarely on tax incentives. The first one asked, do state policymakers have the evidence they need to determine whether tax incentives are delivering a strong return? And the second one asked, are policymakers effectively managing the fiscal risks of tax incentives? As a result, PEW has identified policies and practices that put states in a position to answer yes to both of these questions. And this year, we're working with lawmakers and other stakeholders to implement these policies in states across the country. We're recommending 3 main elements that help states design effective and accountable economic development strategies. Next slide. First, policymakers need to carefully plan before they approve or expand an incentive so that they avoid writing blank checks. Second, states need to thoroughly evaluate all of their incentive programs at regular intervals. And third, states have to ensure that evaluation results inform lawmakers' choices about whether to renew, change, or end particular incentives. Today, we will focus on the second of these 3 elements, the evaluation. Next slide. By asking and answering key policy-relevant questions, evaluations can really reveal a more accurate picture of an incentive's economic impact, including benefits, costs, and unintended consequences. These questions include, did the incentive affect the choices that businesses made? Were existing businesses harmed by the incentive? And did the benefits of the incentive outweigh the negative effects of the tax increases or spending cuts that were needed to offset it? And there really isn't a simple way to isolate the impact of a tax incentive, but a number of analysts, including the speakers today, have used some really creative approaches to get at these answers. Next slide. The best evaluations go a step beyond this analysis, and they draw conclusions that lawmakers can consider and act upon. In order to do this, policymakers need to set clear, measurable program goals. These goals should link to a state's economic development strategy, and they should also be measurable so that evaluators can use related metrics to determine whether the incentive has worked as intended. So for instance, the goal of a tax incentive might be to create high-quality jobs, and then the evaluator would use specific metrics to determine how well the incentive is actually accomplishing that goal. Regardless of whether a program has these clear and measurable goals, the evaluation can still draw some solid conclusions that help state leaders take more informed, decisive action on tax incentives. Evaluations can also draw conclusions about ways an incentive might be improved. We recommend that states conduct quality evaluations like these for all of their incentives, and that states do evaluations on a regular basis. Evaluating all of the incentives regularly allows states to compare incentive programs to each other and to determine which ones are working and which aren't. And they can also see which ones are duplicative, which are complementary, and whether all of their incentives are working in concert to achieve the state's overall economic goals. Next slide. Let me wrap up by saying that while understanding lawmakers' past performance is a necessary part of our work, we're really excited about the opportunity to help states develop a successful framework for the future. We want you all to have the facts that you need to design sound policies and to ensure that you're not missing important economic opportunities nor creating more risk than your budget and constituents can afford. We've been very encouraged by the response our research has generated, and we're already working in several states where leaders have asked us for our advice and assistance to incorporate our findings and recommendations into their work. We're eager to help you, too, in whatever way we can. So in some states, we help in a very technical way by working with state commissions or with analysts to think through and tackle some of the evaluation challenges they're facing. In those states, we share information from academic literature and we look at other states' best practices to help inform processes and methodologies. Other states are seeking legislative changes to address some of the topics I talked about today. In those cases, we'll work directly with legislators to help them design and promote legislation. Our goal in those states is to help the state implement a system of best practices that works for them. And we look forward to talking with you about your interests and priorities and how our efforts may contribute to your success. And now I want to turn it over to David Kirshner so he can share more about his experience with evaluating tax incentives. David?
Thank you. This is David Kirshner speaking from Minnesota. I'm a senior evaluator with the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor. And we can go ahead and go to the first slide. Thanks. So the JOBZ program, which I'm going to talk about, was a signature economic development program associated with the former Governor Tim Pawlenty, although it was passed with bipartisan support. It passed the Minnesota legislature in 2003 and was implemented starting on January 1st, 2004. The program provided substantial tax reductions to qualifying businesses. The law allowed local governments outside of the metropolitan area, that's outside the Twin Cities metropolitan area, to designate areas of land within their jurisdictions as JOBZ zones. Businesses that relocated or expanded into a zone and signed an agreement with local governments were exempt from paying a variety of taxes related to their operations in the zone. And those tax exemptions are still in place. They last until 2015. Nearly all of the agreements required businesses to hire additional employees. Our office was asked to review the program in 2007, and we released our report in early 2008. And we found some pretty significant problems with the JOBZ program. Next slide, please. An important question for any evaluation is determining the standard you're measuring the program against. So one of our first questions was, what was the program trying to achieve? We looked both at the text of the legislation and at the legislative history. For example, one section of the bill outlined a set of criteria for JOBZ regions that appeared to target the program toward economically distressed rural areas. It also was clear from the legislative discussions and from the title of the program that the interest of most legislators was to increase employment. At the time that the program was passed, there was a lot of discussion about strengthening the ability of Minnesota businesses to compete with other states and to prevent Minnesota businesses from moving elsewhere. And then another part of the legislation required businesses that did not meet their JOBZ obligations to pay back many of the tax benefits that they received. So we were interested in whether or not the state agency administering the program is carrying out that part of the law. And then the last two questions on here are the sorts of things we ask in most evaluations. You know, was the state agency basically doing a good job, and was it accurately reporting what was going on? On to the next slide, please. Now, to start on economic distress, we found that the way that the legislature had written the law had enabled the state agency to extend the program to pretty much the entire state outside of the Twin Cities metropolitan area. Although regions were supposed to apply to be part of the program based on those economic distress criteria, there was no limitation on how big regions could be. So the outstate counties, with the assistance of the state agency, simply divided themselves into 10 regions, which was the maximum allowed. There were 10 applications, they were all granted, and everybody was in. So pretty much every city and town outside the metro area was eligible to designate JOBZ zones in their jurisdictions and negotiate deals with businesses. Next slide, please. The fact that pretty much every local jurisdiction was using JOBZ meant that we weren't really able to compare locations with JOBZ to locations that didn't have JOBZ. That had been one of our first ideas, but it turned out that there weren't really enough locations without the program to make that method work. But we did ask some other kind of both broader and more specific questions. On a macro level, we looked at how much of the overall job growth in the various JOBZ regions was attributable to the program. And we concluded that JOBZ wasn't really making much of a difference in overall economic activity in the regions. We also came at it from the micro level by using unemployment insurance data from the participating businesses to see whether their employment had, in fact, increased since their entry into the program. Our conclusion was that at least 1/3, and perhaps as many as 2/3 of the businesses in the program had not hired as many people as the state agency was reporting that they had hired. Next slide, please. With regard to competition, we looked to see where businesses had been before relocating into the JOBZ zones. What we found was that the majority of relocating businesses in the program had simply relocated from elsewhere in the same city or occasionally from a nearby city. Only 5% of the relocating businesses in the program had actually come from a different state. We also considered whether or not the businesses that were in the program were likely threats to move out of state based on who their customers were. And quite a few businesses didn't appear likely to move out of the state or really to move anywhere. Businesses in the program some of the businesses in the program included construction contractors, warehouse and distribution centers. There was a garbage hauler, a farm implement dealer, an animal hospital. Not businesses that we thought were likely to, pick up stakes and move because their customers were local. It was also clear from our interviews with local officials that for many of the businesses in the program, their primary competitors were other Minnesota businesses, which then led us to question the employment numbers further. For if some of these businesses were doing better, that might simply reflect that other Minnesota businesses who had not received the subsidies were doing worse. Next slide, please. As I noted, we wanted to see whether the state agency was effectively monitoring businesses for compliance. Using unemployment insurance data, the agreements signed with local governments, and the tax forms filed by participating businesses, we checked to see whether the businesses in the program appeared to be meeting their obligations. And we found that a lot of them weren't. Some just weren't meeting them at all. Others had missed deadlines but might eventually have met their hiring goals in the future. We also found that the state agency's compliance process was extremely slow and hadn't identified all of the businesses that we had that appeared not to be meeting their obligations. Next slide. Unfortunately, this weak compliance process was just one symptom of a poorly run program. We looked at the subsidy agreements that were signed by the local governments and businesses, and we found a lot of problems. There were agreements that were so badly written that they did not require businesses to hire anyone, or were written in such a way that no hiring was actually required until 2015 after the businesses had already received all of the tax breaks. Some agreements required businesses to hire new employees but didn't require them to retain their existing employees. And several of the agreements contained provisions that actually conflicted with state law. Perhaps most disturbing, a number of the problems that we found in these agreements were due to the poor wording in the sample agreement that had been distributed by the state agency to local governments. The reporting form used by the state agency to monitor activity in the program was pretty poorly designed. It was very confusing, and it caused many local governments to accidentally misreport performance by participating businesses. We identified instances where such misunderstandings meant hundreds of jobs were double counted. Lastly, it was clear that many local governments simply allowed businesses to enter the program with very minimal obligations. Nearly half of the business agreements required participating businesses to create 5 jobs or less, and this is for 12 years of tax breaks. Next slide, please. So here are some of the key flaws that we identified with this program. First, the idea to have local governments decide who got state tax breaks turned out to be pretty ill-advised. It meant that local concerns and not statewide interests were driving the decision-making. There was no meaningful limit on program entry. Anyone who met the most minimal qualifications could enter, so there were no incentives for businesses to go beyond that minimum level when negotiating with these agreements with local communities. There was no checking to see if participants were competing with other Minnesota firms that might be in the same line of business, so that we might just be moving around jobs and economic activity within the state without actually increasing it. Also, the program was all or nothing. Those participating got 12 years of tax breaks, and those who weren't participating got nothing. We thought that maybe smaller tax breaks for lower levels of hiring might have made more sense. And as I've already mentioned, we had some extremely sloppy administration and weak enforcement. Last slide, please. So I tried to think what lessons some of you in other states might, or in Minnesota, if there are any of you here, might take away from our evaluation. The first, I'll say, is never assume that your data is good. Determine exactly how it's collected and recorded, and if possible, look for sources of independent verification. As an audit agency, we had the ability to go and use tax returns and unemployment insurance data, which is certainly a benefit. But even if you don't have that kind of access to non-public information, look at what is publicly available and see if there are unlikely outcomes. Using just publicly available data, we noted that one business in the program had promised to create 10 jobs, but it was listed in the state agency reports as having created 978 jobs. It took one 5-minute phone call to a local government official to confirm that that wasn't right. It was a decimal point error that no one at the state agency had caught. So that was one 5-minute phone call that led to a reduction of nearly 1,000 jobs in the public reports claimed by the state agency for this program. Next, spend the time to read the law carefully and read the documents carefully. What are the individuals and businesses receiving the incentives really required to do in order to get those incentives? And what processes are actually in place to enforce those requirements? How much are the incentives actually worth? When you're looking at a tax subsidy program, don't focus solely on who is in the program. Think about the competition. Does creating jobs or economic activity in one place simply mean that they could be moved from somewhere else within your state? And if so, does that change whether or not you think the program is a success? If it's a jobs program, look critically at the types of jobs involved. Would these jobs likely exist anyway because a market exists that wants those services or products? If businesses receiving subsidies have to meet certain requirements, look carefully at what processes have been set up to enforce them. And talk to people to find out what is really happening, not just what is supposed to happen on paper. And lastly, as you're conducting your evaluation, look for those illustrative stories that will drive your point home when you release your report. That decimal point error is a good example. People remember that, and it drives home a finding that was based on a lot of other evidence that we found, that the state agency was really not up to snuff on monitoring and taking care of the program. So on to the last slide, which gives people a link. Thank you very much. And I guess we go on to Brent next.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Brent Lane. I'm at the Keenan Institute of Private Enterprise, part of the business school at the University of North Carolina. And I'm going to speak to you about our experience in North Carolina evaluating tax incentives. And I appreciated David providing an excellent overview of methodology. We followed many of the similar issues and methods that he probably used there in Minnesota. Although I will confess that we took a slightly different orientation as we originated this project. Those of you who are facing the challenge of evaluating tax incentives or economic development incentives more broadly are going to encounter the same thing that I'm sure David and I did, which is either you don't have enough data to start with or you pull your hair out trying to get to it. We had the experience of both of those, but we had a number of advantages in the work that we did. Next slide, please. First of all, North Carolina until 1996 had prided itself on refusing to use economic development incentives. To that point, it had emphasized investing in workforce development, infrastructure, and education, and was also benefiting from being a Sun Belt state. So in many ways, it was sitting in a very advantageous economic development position. And there was some disdain for the lesser states in our area of the country who had to resort to tax and other economic development incentives. Nonetheless, after a few prominent failures in economic development competitions, the state very carefully, to its credit, developed a portfolio of tax credits, similar in many ways to probably those you have in your state, that were begun in 1996 for a very narrowly defined set of geographic areas and industry types that over the following 10 years were expanded to include a wider range of industry and effectively all of the state of North Carolina, although a complex system of tiers was created to distinguish distressed counties from less distressed counties. And I will also say that in addition to tax incentives, the state also created its first grant incentives. And in our work, we are always careful to distinguish between the tax credits, which are statutory, and that if you're eligible and apply, you will receive the credit, versus the grant incentive program, which is discretionary and is subject to some very specific performance and enforcement measures. Next slide. Now, I had the good fortune to work with a gentleman named Bill Lee, who was a prominent corporate executive as these tax credits and other programs were being developed. And he had the misfortune to die in the process of lobbying the legislature to adopt these things. So he moved from being a leader to being the title of the tax credits themselves. And in our state, they were known as the Bill Lee Act tax credits. And as you can see from this array here, they're probably consistent with the sort of credits that you may have experienced deploying in your state as well. Although it's important to recognize, and Kevin made this distinction as well, that for many of these credits, and these were distinctly different types of credits, they were not explicitly tied to job creation requirements. They were tied primarily to investment, and there were different levels of credit that might accrue based on which geographic area of North Carolina the project was in, based on a level of distress and the tier system I described. And it's important to note as well that the tax credits had a maximum in terms of how much tax liability a company could write off in any given year, but it had generous carry forwards on that. Next slide, please. Now, in 2007, the state experienced a number of tumultuous, high-profile economic development projects that were considering locating or expanding in the state. And that's really provided the impetus for the legislature to undertake an evaluation of the entirety of the state's economic development incentives, which included the grant incentives, which, as you can see bolded here, were very high profile, very identifiable, made all the headlines, and were prominent as what typified incentives in both the mind of the legislature and in the mind of the public. So deals like the tire companies and the server farm projects that came to the state attracted a tremendous amount of attention and actually generated some concern within the legislature that we weren't certain what we were trying to accomplish with our incentive program. But it needs to be recognized that we were asked to lead a multi-institutional, adequately, in this case, funded evaluation. We were able to do it out of a university context and out of a business school context, which is an advantage perhaps out of doing it out of a staff position within the legislature. And we had the great fortune to work with a diverse and, I will say, surprisingly committed legislative study committee over a period of 18 months. So we had a number of advantages in how we carried this out. And frankly, there have been several built-in evaluations into these incentive programs that have been successful in doing some quality work and generating credible reports, but had essentially no influence over the continuing evolution of the incentive program. So we were very cognizant that reports as a product of an evaluation were woefully insufficient, and therefore we focused quite a bit of our effort on the process of the evaluation and the engagement with the legislators in that process. Next slide, please. Now, the first thing that we communicated to our legislators that while the grant incentives were gathering all the headlines, that the vast majority of what North Carolina was spending on incentives was occurring through those bill lead tax credits. So what you faced as a legislator and as a member of the public was a complete misperception of how the state was funding economic development incentive programs. And as a result, the tax credits, 98% of what we were spending, were essentially going unexamined. And too much attention was being focused just on the grants. Next slide. But I know our interest here is discussing tax incentives, and certainly by the time we were engaged to do our research, the incentive programs that the state had launched in 1996 had a 10-year track record to evaluate. So one of the things that overcame my trepidation about doing this project, because I always thought that it was a great project to do in someone else's state, was the appeal of all the data that these programs had generated. The question, though, was would we be able to access them? So we had a $2 billion program, 10 years of operating history, and thousands of participating companies. How do we get that data? Because that's what we needed to do our evaluation. Next slide. There we go. Now, Kevin made this point, and I'll make it again, and I know I'm speaking to you the way I speak to our legislators and the county commissioners and that level of decision makers that we deal with routinely. The first thing we had to insist on was that the Legislative Study Commission, the legislators themselves, needed to specify what the performance objectives were of our incentive programs. And that sounds rather obvious, but I do think, and I think Kevin experienced this, is that while programs like this are launched with some very compelling and attractive objectives in mind, given the lack typically of enforcement and oversight, those get lost through a lack of attention. So we worked with our legislators, and we had, as I mentioned, the committee structure, study committee structure, which met every month for 18 months. So we first began by having them define the criteria upon which we would perform our evaluation. And similar to what Kevin was speaking of, the legislative criteria were first job creation, secondly were we benefiting areas of the state who, but for the incentives, might see very little growth. Interestingly, they were also put a priority on identifying whether the state's economy as a whole was more competitive as a result of these incentive programs. And in 2006, there was already a developing interest in what were the alternatives to targeted tax reduction through tax incentives rather than overall tax reduction of corporate taxes. So first meetings of the committee were to establish those criteria. Next slide. Now, knowing that a tremendous amount of very fine data was available theoretically, we designed the task to answer those core questions posed by the legislature, or what I call the granular level. We wanted to understand not only, we wanted particularly to understand how the incentives were being deployed. Obviously, if we were focusing on one of the criteria being distressed areas, we needed to know which companies specifically, where they were located, and most interestingly, we needed to know whether the companies were indeed adding jobs after they received the incentive, whether that was an explicit obligation of the tax incentive, which in most of our incentives there was not a job creation requirement, there was an investment obligation created. But we wanted to be able to look at the behavior of the firms, both pre and post incentive, and we supplemented that work trying to address the question of but for, do these incentives affect corporate decision making? We instituted a survey of about 700 companies, executives of both incented firms, those who had received incentives, and also those who had not, to see what effect the presence of incentives was having on the mindset of business decision makers throughout the state. And then lastly, we did a number of very in-depth case studies on utilization, which focused primarily on those higher profile grant projects rather than the tax incentive projects themselves. Next slide. Now, I know you've encountered this. If you haven't already, David alluded to it, is that knowing the data exists is very different than having access to the data. What we knew existed because, in our case, our Department of Revenue had a very timely and accurate database of which companies had utilized the tax credits. We needed access to their employment data. We also, in some cases, needed access to some confidential tax filings, and we were able to secure access to those through some special legislation run through our study committee members. They gave us access to otherwise confidential data through Revenue and the Department of Commerce. And in particular, we developed a very close working relationship with our employment security staff, the labor market information people in particular, that we were able to gather together the quarterly employment numbers 5 years prior, 5 years after the incentive date for most firms. So we had a tremendous wealth of all that data that had made this project interesting and compelling to begin with. Although I will tell you, there's quite a bit of cloak and dagger involved in handling some of these materials. You will, if you try to negotiate these minefields, you will deal with lawyers and security people, and we kept things under lock and key with cables on them and things of that nature. But certainly the data is available if you're able to generate the legislative support for that access. Next slide. First thing we needed to make clear to our legislators is while they thought tax incentives were premised on the objective of job creation, the reality, and I think Kevin's experience in Minnesota parallels this, the reality was entirely different. That the vast majority of tax credits were going to companies based on investment in plant, property, and equipment, or as you could think, automation that was investment in capital that was really displacing labor. And the credits that were actually going for specific job creation, and these were credits that required identifying the employee by Social Security number and name, and we had access to that information as well. The reality is very little of the tax credits were going explicitly for job creation. That doesn't mean there wasn't job creation occurring, at least at this point, but that was not the inherent intent and structure of our tax incentives. And that was quite surprising, not only to our legislators, but the public as well, because this was a very open process. Next slide. In addition to not fulfilling the objective of job creation, very little of the incentive money was actually going to our most distressed counties. So 2 of the primary criteria our committee was basing a performance evaluation on were not being met through the incentive program, specifically the tax incentive program. So very quickly we were able to address and and enlighten our committee that what we thought as a state we were investing a considerable amount of money in the way of tax credits was not actually going toward our expected goals. Next slide. Now, the way we undertook this evaluation, and it may be in part because of my background in finance, is we tried to avoid the quick question that was usually posed, which is, do incentives work? I'm sure you've all heard that from legislators or reporters or citizens. Do incentives work? My response to that has always been, yes, they work, but they don't all work equally well. So like you would evaluate your investment portfolio, we propose that the state should evaluate its incentive portfolio and determine what types of incentives were working best, where was the highest return for the public expenditure through the tax credits. So we were looking at the post-incentive job growth by the different types of incentives. Then we wanted to look at examine the performance of companies in general who were receiving incentives over time to see whether the incentives were going to companies who were in a growth phase or in a decline phase. And then lastly, we examined the performance of the population of incentive firms relative to the North Carolina economy. And so in our case, while I'm sure you're all facing this, there's the question of, do incentives influence decisions? Is there causality? The first thing we worked to establish was there simply correlation? Were incented companies correlated with companies that created new jobs? Was job creation correlated with incentive use? And we would address causality later. Next slide. Now here's a whole lot of data thrown on one chart. And we use this with our legislators not only to educate them, but just to impress them that this is a lot of work. But also because of their action, we had access to a tremendous amount of data. What you're looking at here is the relative job growth performance of a set of 1,200 companies for whom we had quarterly data over a 10-year period. It's not the whole population of incentive firms, which was about 3,000, but we had 1,200 in particular that we could show 10 years of employment performance. And what that found was that essentially half of the companies, regardless of when they got the incentive, had added jobs during the 10-year period, and another half, regardless of when they got the incentive, had actually not added jobs or had shed jobs. So the population of companies that were receiving incentives in this 10-year period were essentially split 50-50 between those in a growth mode and those in a declining mode. Next slide. The more interesting is to get to the performance of the companies after they received the incentive, and then to look at the performance based on the sort of the type of incentive, the type of tax credits they receive. What you're going to see is 3 or 4 graphs that show companies that received an incentive in the year 2004, and you're looking at 10 years of the average employment history of those companies, in this case, who received the machinery and equipment tax credit. Bottom line is, this is a graph that shows companies that got an incentive tax credit for investment that occurred in 2004. What it reveals is, we picked 2004 for this purpose today because it's some of the exogenous effects of recessions doesn't show up in here. It clutters the picture a bit. But what we saw very clearly is that the tax credits going for investment were being used by companies that were shedding jobs. Very reasonably, in a competitive economy, they were displacing labor with capital. And while that may be a very valid business strategy, from a public policy standpoint, with an expectation that your credits are supporting job creation, the vast majority of our tax credits that were going for incentives were being used by companies who subsequently shed jobs. That could have been readily anticipated. It could have been routinely monitored. It was not, so it came as a bit of a revelation at this point. Now let's look at another incentive. Next slide. We were looking for, again, the correlation between companies receiving incentives and their post-incentive employment track record. In this case, we're looking at the one that's specifically tied to job creation. Now, to understand, this was one of the only one of our portfolio of tax credits where the company had to commit to adding jobs. And what should be remarkable to you here is that, yes, the companies did add jobs post-incentive, but it was by no means a significant number of jobs, nor was it sustainable. So they added some jobs, they took the tax credit. Subsequent years, they shed those jobs. So regardless of the effectiveness immediately post-incentive, what you saw was the incentives were used by a generation of firms that while they may add a few more jobs, ultimately would be in decline. So even the job creation credit was showing a very weak correlation with subsequent job growth. Next slide. Now, of the credits we looked at, the only one that we found a strong post-incentive correlation for job growth was the R&D tax credit. Now, I would imagine most states have the R&D tax credit because we're simply mirroring the federal tax credit for R&D. But this was the only credit we found in the portfolio that North Carolina put in place that we could argue was correlated, much less causally linked, but correlated with future job growth. And that played into our findings. Next slide, please. We compared the performance in job creation of the incented company cohort, which in this case is the red line, the red dotted line, and we compared their performance to the North Carolina economy overall. Now, this is pretty macro, but the lesson we learned from this was, frankly, that in the beginning years of our tax credit program, our incented companies were outperforming the North Carolina economy. Well, that certainly should have been the case throughout the period. Of course, what we saw in later years after 2001 is that they were actually underperforming the economy. We interpreted that as possibly meaning, and I think most probably meaning, that the approach to using tax credits worked in the 90s and wasn't working beyond for a variety of business and economic reasons. In other words, tax credits may have been a good idea in the 90s, but they were no longer a good idea as our economy had evolved. But our portfolio of incentives had not evolved along with the economy. Next slide. Next, there we are. Now, what became a very important message from this evaluation of tax incentives was an overall evaluation of how the success or lack of success of the incentives attributed to or did not attribute to North Carolina's overall economic success. And this has been something that's become a rather important finding in the course of a lot of economic development research in North Carolina, a lot of economic development policy as well. What you're seeing here is a graphic of North Carolina's per capita income as a share of the U.S. And what I like to tell legislators is that from 1969 to 1997, North Carolina's economy was benefiting its citizens dramatically. We had risen from 79% to 93%. Now, that pink square in 1997 is the 10-year period of the implementation of not only the tax credits that I've been describing, but also the grant incentives. So while those incentives have received a lot of popular press and has pushed the state to the top of the site selection, magazine rankings, and a number of other measures of economic development success, clearly, and this is something the legislature was very interested in, clearly success in economic development, clearly the success of economic incentives, regardless of how successful they were, was not yielding economic success in our state. So we put the economic incentives and the tax incentives in the context of larger economic goals. Next slide. So our findings were that our tax credits, while they had been very carefully and thoughtfully crafted, I mentioned North Carolina was late to the game, so we had the benefit of the learning curve of a number of our neighbor and competing states in designing our tax credits. What we found was that even when they worked, we were seeing a diminishing return on that investment as the economy evolved and tax credits became less influential and were increasingly being used to support labor displacement. As a result, what the legislature's intent was in maintaining those incentives, the results were actually contrary to those goals. So you really have a counterproductive result of increasingly expensive tax expenditures. Interestingly, when we did our survey of non-incented companies, we hear a lot of ballyhoo about business climates and how important that is to corporate executive decision making. What you found is that the presence of these incentives targeted to a few companies and a few industries was having a profoundly negative effect on the perception of the business climate by other companies who were not eligible or utilizing the incentives. Ultimately, we concluded and recommended a reallocation of North Carolina's incentive portfolio, including the tax credit incentives. Next slide. I mentioned that we undertook this project with a very strong focus on process rather than just a report. That involved a tremendous amount of engagement, not only by having the monthly meetings with our study committee, but also continuing engagement with the legislature, even as it's changed leadership from one party to the next, on incorporating those recommendations into policy. The results of our report in 2009 was written into a broad tax reform initiative that was proposed by the leadership of the legislature at that time. The leadership changed parties in subsequent years. It was adopted by the incoming political leadership and was actually implemented in a 2013 tax reform last month. So our recommendation, which was to eliminate all the tax credits but for the R&D tax credit, the only one that was correlated with job growth, was adopted by the legislature. And we also recommended that it would be better to eliminate those tax credits that were targeted in favor of a reduction in the corporate tax rate. That was also written into the 2013 tax reform bill. I believe that's the last of my slides. I thank you for this opportunity. Oh, I do have one more slide. Excuse me. Lessons learned. First of all, from day one or even before, because I certainly did this when I was approached by legislative staff on organizing this research, I needed to make sure that the legislative leadership really was serious about this effort. So there were a number of meetings before we ever proposed how to undertake the work with legislative leadership. I think the regularity with which we were able to work with a consistent set of legislators gave us a constituency that added impetus to adaptation, and also their engagement in identifying very specifically the performance metrics helped us in structuring the appropriate methodology. And again, the methodology was designed around the goals, not around the available data. The data was made available because of our work with the legislature. And then lastly, and I think we lose this all the time, is the question not whether incentives work, not how well they work, but ultimately in terms of economic well-being for our citizens, do they even matter? No matter how successful are they achieving our broader economic goals? I know that's my last slide, so thank you again.
So we just want to remind folks that if you have a question, go ahead and type that into the box on the right-hand side of the screen. And we got one question from somebody. They wanted to know if we would have access to this visual information for download. And yes, we are going to be posting this online. I believe NCSL is going to have that available on their website. We also got a question for Brent. They wanted to know that they commented that the results in that evaluation were for companies with a single location, and that may have eliminated some of the largest employers who were using the credits. So Brent, how would the results have been different if you had examined companies with more than one location?
Well, we did examine companies with more than one location. There was quite a bit of analysis and results that go beyond what I presented today. It's clear that incentives, regardless of type, and tax incentives in particular, are most effective in net future job growth when they are limited to new locations. And in fact, when these incentives were first developed in North Carolina, you were only eligible if you were creating a new location. It could be an establishment by a multi-location firm, but it was limited to essentially companies moving into the state or new plants being opened by existing firms. So we did capture that as well. Some of that is on that slide where we had a single location, but we did also look at multi-location companies. It doesn't change the overall employment effect. There's one point I should have made clear when I showed all the dots on the slide, is that while we were showing that slightly over half of the companies were adding new jobs, the net effect, essentially larger companies were shedding more jobs than smaller companies were adding new jobs.
Great, thank you. We also got a question. Someone was wondering if there are similar case studies that cover examples from many states, and we just want to draw your attention to the Pew report evidence counts. We actually looked at all the states, all 50 states, and we reported on some of the best practices that we found in many of those states. So we would just want to draw your attention to that report, which is available on, on our website. We got another question for David. Were there any reforms to the JOBZ program undertaken after your report?
Yes, there were some, not as many as we had recommended. One of the issues was that there was a little bit of disagreement between the governor, Republican governor, and Democratic legislature over what to do about the issues that we raised. But certainly there were some immediate changes. One of which was that the state agency now has to. I mean, yeah, the program is still technically running, although since the tax benefits expire in 2015, I doubt they're having a whole lot of new applicants. But anyway, the state agency has to approve all agreements now. It can no longer be done by local governments. But some of the other recommendations that we made, particularly for there to be a cap on the program to limit the number of people involved, those did not go forward, and there was not agreement among the legislature and the governor on how to fix those sorts of things. Another thing that changed, we highlighted that the state agency was not meeting, doing a good job of enforcing some of the compliance rules that had been put into the original law, and the outcome of that recommendation was that they reduced the penalties for companies that weren't complying. So that wasn't quite what we had suggested.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that I'm actually going to pass off to my colleague, Bob Zarednik. How would one go about evaluating the but-for question?
So that's a great question, and once again, we'll point out that we have lots of examples in our report evidence counts, and we're also available, the Pew team, to help. We're helping states now do these sorts of evaluations and try to answer this question. The short answer is that there's not one way to do this. As our speakers have pointed out, there's lots of different approaches depending on the type of incentive and the goals of the program. A couple examples that we found that are interesting that you might want to look into further. In Oregon, an evaluation of the state's business energy tax credit developed financial models for projects like wind farms and that received the incentive, and the study used the financial models to help determine when the incentive would encourage an energy project to go forward that would otherwise would not have, and when it would benefit projects that would have happened even without the incentive. So that's one option. There's an evaluation in the state of Iowa that analyzed whether the state's R&D tax credit was having an impact on things like the number of patents granted to the research or the research spending. And in that case, the report compared the economic outcome in states like Iowa that had research tax credits to other states without similar incentives to figure out how much of a difference the incentive was making. So there's a wide range of approaches to this, and we're certainly available to help out as you start working on these types of evaluations.
Thank you. So I think we have run out of time, but we got a ton of great questions, and so we are going to try to follow up with folks. And if you had a question that you definitely wanted to make sure got addressed, then please feel free to reach out to us either at NCSL or at Pew. We're happy to help with that. Mandy?
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the conclusion of this webinar, and I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our panelists. All of the presentations were very informative, and we certainly appreciate all of your participation. If you have any questions following this event, please feel free to contact NCSL staff Aaron Snyder. His contact information is listed on the screen. Next slide, please. This webinar has been recorded and will be available along with additional resources on the NCSL website. Again, that's www.ncsl.org. And then next slide. And lastly, please take a moment to share your feedback on this webinar by taking a short survey at the link listed on the screen. And with that, we'll sign off, and thank you very much for your interest and participation today.